We have a special guest. You don't want to miss this episode. State Representative Vicki Lopez, a Miami Republican who has quite the backstory. You want to listen to it. It includes time in prison and a presidential pardon and oh so much more. Stick with us for a deeper dive with State Rep Vicki Lopez.
I think when you recognize that you have been, first of all, found guilty of something you haven't done, and now you're going to leave your family for a certain period of time, I do believe that it is probably one of the toughest things I've done other than lose my parents.
You're listening to A Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by City and State, Florida.
Welcome to A Deeper Dive with me, Dara Cam, senior writer for the News Service of Florida. We are very excited to have a special guest with us this morning, an old friend of mine. She's not old, but we go way back. State Representative Vicki Lopez. She has the most interesting backstory, and she's going to tell you all about it herself. Good morning, Representative Lopez.
Good morning, Dara. I can't tell you how excited I am to be with you this morning.
Representative Lopez has a unique story that she's going to tell us all about. She was elected in November, but she has been a steady presence in the Capitol for many years. In fact, that's where we first met, probably almost 20 years ago. And that's why I'm going to call her Vicki and not Rep, because we go that far back. Vicki was convicted of federal crime and served time in federal prison. Her conviction was vacated, and she has been an advocate in the criminal justice reform arena for many years. And we have a personal connection in that way, and also we know each other from her advocacy in the Capitol. So Vicki, I'm just going to let you tell your story, because I know there are many of our listeners are not familiar with it.
So thank you so much, Dara, for the opportunity to talk about it, right? Because as you said, I was elected in November, and it was an issue in my campaign, and no one ever got it right. So this is a really good opportunity to talk to your listeners about my story, about what drives me and why I actually decided to, actually run for office. So back in 1990, I was a Lee County Commissioner in Fort Myers, and I was having a relationship with a lobbyist, and the lobbyist and I, he lived in Washington, I lived in Fort Myers, and somehow an investigative reporter decided to ask questions about the relationship. And the first question that he asked me, and I asked him to he had a series of questions, so I asked him to put them all in writing so I could study them and send them back to him. And the first question was, what is your relationship with the lobbyist? And I said it was professional, because it was, in fact. I had been assigned to the Washington sort of issues by my local county commission, and there were other series of questions that I answered, and I dropped that into the mail. And so a couple of months later, there was, and it's kind of I'm giving you the Reader's Digest version, obviously, because it's a lengthy story.
And I don't mean to laugh, because it's a very serious story, and we have all the time in the world, so you can give us Reader's Digest, or you can give us the full shebang. It's up to you.
So I feel like it's worthy of at least explaining it, because it was the complexity of the case, I think, that really speaks to the story, if you will. So anyway, the lobbyist and I, he had sent approximately $4,000 of monies through the mail to cover our long distance phone calls and a security deposit that we had on a apartment that we were sharing. And eventually, the government alleged that I had given him his clients, he had two clients, $400 million worth of business for those small checks that came that totaled $4,000. So we were both indicted on one count of bribery, one count of honest services mail fraud, and 9 counts of interstate commerce, representing the 9 checks that came from Washington. And I have to tell you that I think it was almost Kafkaesque, if you will, that you would be, somehow doing your job, and that someone would allege that you were, in some fashion, having corrupted your votes, because that's what it came down to, right? And
this is all playing out in the newspaper at the same time that you're going through this legal crisis, right?
Correct. Fort Myers at that time was a very small town, and the downtown 100 is what we called the people that had the power in Lee County at that time.
Right.
And it was a small southern town. I recall so clearly the prosecutor wearing cowboy boots, everyone wearing cowboy boots, right?
But you.
But me. And I was the first Hispanic and third or fourth woman ever elected to the Lee County Commission. And, I feel like a lot of that did play itself out in this story. And I do recall thinking to myself, I think if I just quit, it'll go away. And before the indictment, I actually did resign from office. And I moved to Washington and made a life with the lobbyist. But, the federal government did not quit. It actually revved it up. And I think because the lobbyist was, in fact, someone much more important than I was, and they were probably coming after him. And I was just collateral damage at that point. And so after the indictment, we prepared for trial, and I was able to prove at trial that every single vote I took did not correspond at all with the checks. In fact, every time a check came, I voted against his client. So there was no way for the government to prove quid pro quo. The real issue was the honest services fraud charge, which in my case did not mean what you would think a layman's term would mean. Honest being, were you honest or not? This was more about the legal term for honest services fraud is about whether or not you used the mail to further corrupt your votes. And that was the underlying charge for the bribery charge, right? That in fact I had lied in my response to the newspaper reporter when I did not say that the relationship was both professional and personal. So because I didn't do that, the government said it appeared that I was trying to hide what was going on with the bribery, right? Somehow that they were able to draw inference to those two charges. And that honest services charge hadn't been used in many, many years. It has since been used in a lot of cases. And it's important to note that as we get further into the story. So I went to trial, and I had to move my trial to Tampa because I was so well known in Fort Myers. And I was really actually only well known as my first name. Everyone knew who Vicki was. And so we moved my trial to Tampa, and the federal judge there threw out the honest services fraud charge. And the government stopped the trial and appealed that to the 11th Circuit. The 11th Circuit took 2 years to throw it back in. So at that juncture, I was tried in my hometown in Fort Myers. And, I think there's so much purpose around what happened to me as sort of a precursor for what would come in my work in criminal justice, because I saw every facet of the system, at least the first part of that system, the justice system. And I remember every single feeling, every emotion that goes with being put on trial for something you haven't done. And so I recall the 2-week trial, and at the end of the 2-week trial, the jury came in. It spent some time during their deliberations. They asked the judge, who, by the way, was a retired judge who'd been appointed by President Nixon. He was very, very old, and he was on retiree status, and he refused to give the jury the instructions that they had requested, which was, what does it really mean? What does honest services fraud really mean? And he refused the answer. So they went back to deliberate. And when they came back with their verdicts, the lobbyist was found not guilty of all charges. And I was found not guilty of bribery. I was found not guilty of the 9 counts of interstate commerce. But because I had said on the witness stand that I had in fact lied to the newspaper reporter because I thought my personal relationships were my own, they had found me guilty of honest services fraud, which for many legal scholars was a totally inconsistent verdict, because you couldn't have found me not guilty of bribery.
Right.
And, so
right. How could you have done the honest services fraud if you weren't guilty of the underlying crimes? Correct. Or the affiliated the associated crimes?
Correct.
Alleged crimes.
Correct. So it was quite inconsistent from our perspective, and so we appealed the conviction, and we learned something about the 11th Circuit, which is why I tell you that I think everyone's, as you track what happened with me, it's a good sort of, I'd say, look at what's happening with other defendants, right? So my conviction was affirmed by the 11th Circuit, which means that there's only one word that's given to you. So the defendant doesn't have the opportunity to appeal that to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. What we learned from that affirmation was, and this is a product of a New York Times front page article, where we learned there were 2 tiers of justice in the 11th Circuit. Judges weren't looking at my case to determine whether or not it had any merit. Lawyers were looking at the case that worked for the 11th Circuit, determining which cases would be heard and which cases would only have. So the
clerks, is that what you mean? The lawyers, the judicial assistants, I think they're not called clerks at the circuit level. They're called JAs, or are they clerks?
I think so. I don't know exactly what the terminology is.
But it's the people who work for the judges, for the appeals court judges.
Right. So they had made a decision, not a judge, but they had made the decision that my case didn't warrant to be heard. So we then appealed to that, because there were a lot of legal scholars looking at it going, now this is even more incredible. And the New York Times actually covered it, saying, goodness, there's 2 tiers of justice here that no one knows about. So we appealed it and asked for an en banc hearing, meaning we wanted all the judges to hear it, right? And they did finally hear the case, but their response was so convoluted. I think they were angry that we put so much attention on what was happening in the court. And I recall that the response even referred to law in the UK and what the founders had thought. It was so convoluted. But at any rate, they affirmed the conviction, and so I prepared for sentencing. And I don't think that anything can prepare you for that. I think when you recognize that you have been, first of all, found guilty of something you haven't done, and now you're going to leave your family for a certain period of time, I do believe that it is probably one of the toughest things I've done, other than lose my parents. I recall so clearly going into that courtroom, but prior to going into the courtroom, I was met outside by jurors who were like, wait a minute, this wasn't supposed to happen. We thought you would just be fined. They didn't understand what had happened.
Wow.
And the lead juror tried to speak to the judge, and he would not permit him into the courtroom because he wanted to talk about what had happened in the jury room and that it had all been a big mistake. They didn't realize that I was actually going to go to prison for this. And so it was very daunting, I think, to try to prepare for sentencing when in fact you knew that you had not committed a crime and you were going to have to now go to prison and leave your family. And at the time, my son was 16, going to be a senior in high school. And I just really believed that it was such an injustice. But, at some juncture, you have to make peace with what's happening. And
But did you also, was there also, because I've talked to other people who've been convicted of crimes and people who have maintained their innocence, you were found, we'll get to that part of your story, but you're facing this uncertainty of the sentencing, but there's so much shame too. I mean, did you, even though you knew you hadn't done anything wrong, did you still feel this like shame that that you had been found guilty and the community was seeing you in this way, and your family and you were having to undergo all this? Or was the fear and uncertainty sort of the most driving emotions then?
I think it was more of, oh my God, I'm really going to have to go to prison for something.
This is really happening, right?
This is actually really, I mean, when you're appealing your case, you always have hope that
Right.
someone, somewhere along the way will in fact, see the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that, and I don't want to speak for my son, but I think I would say that he would have thought, because, you worry most about your children. I think as a mother and potentially a father, although I've done a lot of work with women, you worry so much about what's going to happen to your kids.
Yeah.
Somehow you think that your presence is so required in their lives. And I think too that, Dara, it was, it wasn't shame, because I thought, I think if you've done something wrong,
Right.
you almost have to accept responsibility and know, well, there are consequences to what you've done. This was such a different case because and more importantly, because I'd been found guilty of what I considered to be the much more serious crime. And the lobbyist, who was then my husband, was also found not guilty on everything. So it was just one of those things where you say a glitch has happened in the justice system and no one seems to be able to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm going to pay this price. But something within me, Dara, made me feel like, well, if I've got to go there, there must be a reason why I'm doing this, right? Like you start to seek out what could be the higher purpose. What's the, and I'm a pretty spiritual person. I kept thinking God must have a plan. He must have a plan, because these kind of things don't happen unless there's a plan, and you almost have to surrender into it and say, okay, I'm in for the ride, whatever it is. And I started to change my perspective, knowing that I would go away to prison. I thought, all right, well then how can I be useful there? I continued my, I guess I would say my elected office mentality of service, right? Of public service. I said, I know nothing about prison, but I will clearly learn very quickly and do what I can do there. The same commitment that I made to my constituents, I said, well, there'll just be a change in constituency. I really did. I started to look at it from a very positive perspective, because at some juncture, you have to decide whether you're going to do good time or bad time, as they say inside.
Good time or bad time.
And so, it's interesting to note that, once I got sentenced.
And what was your sentence?
My sentence was 27 months in a federal prison. And I was assigned to, there's only 2 female minimum security facilities in Florida at that time, one in Marianna and one in Coleman, Florida, which is about 50 miles northwest of Orlando. And, I remember, how it seems so surreal that you're literally preparing to go away. And in some cases, it was very strange. In some ways, I felt, and I can tell you this because I sent my son to visit his friends that summer. I didn't know that I had the strength to say goodbye, to be honest with you. So I wrote a letter to him. I typed a letter, and I had this very odd feeling that mothers must have that know they're dying, and they're trying to tell their children everything that they want them to know in the event that they won't be there. yeah, that was the feeling I had. And I was overwhelmed with emotion. I have to tell you, there's nothing like saying goodbye and thinking that you're missing things, or that he's going to be out there on his own, when in fact he wasn't going to be on his own. But in some way, I felt that. So that was so painful, as a mother, to have to do that, right? To send him away, first of all, because I knew I couldn't say goodbye. And I knew the date I was going to self surrender. So I left him this
But
letter.
you were protecting him too from all of that by having him not be there watching
Yeah, watch,
firsthand.
yeah, watching my, leaving, and there's not
Right.
much packing because you're not taking anything with
Right.
you. You're just leaving for two and a
Right.
half years, right?
Right.
So, uh, I recall there were some nuns that had been arrested for protesting at the School of the Americas. And they were actually exiting that prison as I was entering. And someone connected me with them, which is part of, kind of passing it forward, which I've done now because it was so meaningful for them to be able to give me the lay of the land, um, of where I was going, kind of drawing me pictures of the compound so that it would look familiar when I arrived. Sister Mary thought it was important that I feel like it wasn't so
Foreign.
foreign, right? Like, so, I had conversations with her and a woman who'd been arrested with her, Rita, and Sister Mary and Rita, kind of told me that that it was going to be okay, right? Like there were some very good women on the compound. I mean, they gave me so many assurances from their own personal experience that helped me not feel that I was going in cold, right? So that was extremely helpful, which is one of the reasons I do that now, and continue to do it. Excuse me, some 20 years later, is try to be as helpful as I can because I know what everyone's going through. I think the part about me that is so different than criminal justice advocates, especially those 20 years ago, is I had been through the whole system, right? So it wasn't that I studied it or that I became a
Right.
PhD in it. I
You had
knew,
firsthand, intimate knowledge of all facets, from the court system to the actual incarceration.
well, and then thereafter, because we'll talk about the thereafter
Right.
here in a second. But so I went, I self surrendered on August 9th of 1999. And I remember the press being at the sort of entrance of the prison, and I said exactly what I told you, that I had made peace with going, and that I was going to try to be as helpful as possible to the women there in any way that I could be. That proved to be not so smart because the administration was listening to that, and they don't take very kindly at that time, to anyone going to help anybody, right? And I think because I was such a high
Oh,
profile.
here comes trouble.
Oh yes, oh yes.
And where did you go then? Did you go to Coleman or did you
I
go?
did.
Yeah.
I went to FCC Coleman, and there were five there were 500 women incarcerated there, 4 dorms, and I was in F3. And it's funny. There was so many moments during that period of time. First of all, I was greeted by a wonderful officer who made the transition easy. So I always say, look, I can see God in all of this. To be honest with you, not everybody who's ever self-surrendered or been taken into custody has had the experiences I have had. So there have been angels along the way, that looking back now, I'm so very grateful for. And so kind of getting onto the compound was crazy because you're like, wow. And you all you can think of is what you know from TV, which
Right.
is which is not at all. I often want to say to people that, they should consult people like us to let them know what it really looks like, because nothing that you see on TV is what it is. Um, I was serving with 499 really, in the end, very good women, who had been caught up mostly in drug charges, and mostly because of the people that they were surrounded themselves with, in particular the men that they were with.
Right.
And the federal drug crimes are such that that defendant which has the most information and can cooperate greatly with the feds is the one that gets the less time. And so these women had no information. And
Right. They're at the bottom of the totem pole, and so they end up getting more time.
Yes, and they get the
Treated more
maximum,
harshly.
yeah,
Yeah.
because of the mandatory minimums, they get what they get, and they don't have any information to bargain
To
with,
trade
right?
with, right.
So I met a lot. It's such a study, you see, and I turned everything into a positive thing. I said, oh my gosh, I'm here studying this, because I'm so studious and I'm always wanting to learn. And so I took that experience and said, well, okay, if I've got to be here 2.5 years, I'm going to learn everything I can about this system. And I think that the moving situation, of course, was watching them with their kids in visitation. These women have.
Oh, yeah. We'll be right back with State Rep Vicki Lopez.
From the team that brought you Deeper Dive with Dara Cam comes a brand new e-newsletter on the Florida man who may be president. Governor Ron DeSantis is his own conservative brand, an unapologetic culture warrior who could run for the White House as early as 2024. The DeSantis Files is your one-stop shop for the best in reporting, analysis, and opinion on the man's supporters call America's governor. Delivered straight to your inbox twice a week, learn more by emailing editor@cityandstatefl.com. That's cityandstatefl.com. Here at Deeper Dive, we want to hear from you, the listeners. We invite you to send your questions, comments, and feedback to our mailbag. You can reach us at deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. That's deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. Get your 2 cents in by sending us an email.
Welcome back to A Deeper Dive with Dara.
These women had a lot of time.
You have never experienced anything until you have been in a visitation room on a Saturday or a Sunday watching families at the end of the visitation period, when the children are having to be dragged away from their mothers, I don't even have, maybe you have the words to express that, but I have watched that and it is heartbreaking, heart-wrenching.
Well, it's more than that, I think, right? Because I'm going to give you my own perspective. So my son didn't come often. I didn't want him to spend his senior year spending time visiting his mother, and I was perfectly comfortable with it, knowing that he was fine. In those days, 30 years ago now, we didn't have emails, we didn't have the tablets that everybody has. You had a 15-minute call, and at that time, fortunately, we had unlimited time. That as I was leaving, they were moving them into more limited number of minutes. But in the federal system, I could be on the phone all day long, which was helpful. Because I say contact with family is what keeps you sane inside. So I would spend, if I wasn't working, I was on the phone, just talking to friends or family, right? Like it was so, it kept a small bit of normalcy from the outside with
How
me.
did you do that? So you were on a landline.
Yes.
And were you you were on a payphone, and then was there a chair next to
well, we had one chair. I always say, even now, this many years later, I still wipe down sinks when I use them in a bathroom because it's out of respect for the woman who's coming behind you. I still, when I sit on a couch, I remember how blessed I am to have a comfortable couch, because for many months I sat on one of those folding metal chairs. That's your chair.
Right.
And that chair I would take to the phone, and I would sit at the payphone.
You'd bring it with you to the phone.
I would bring it with me to the phone. And of course, out of respect, if someone was waiting to use, there were only 4 payphones per dorm. If someone was in line to use, I would get up and get back in line, right? Because respect inside is a good way of staying safe.
So I'm sorry, I interrupted you because I was sharing my own experience observing in state prison. So this was different, and you're talking about your son.
Yeah, so I didn't have my son as much as I had my friends, and at the time my husband would come, my parents. But here's what happens to you. You get ready for visitation, and it takes everything inside of you to look like it's all okay, because you see, you don't want them to worry, right? You don't want your family to worry about you. So in visitation, you wouldn't say anything that's negative that would cause them to start worrying about you.
Right.
So you expend all this emotion to look and smile and say it's all good and tell me what's going on the outside. So there's all this energetic, emotional, get ready for this whole day visitation. And then
Right.
in the federal system at 3:30, we end. Well, we end visitation at 3 because there's a 4 o'clock count throughout the country. So you got to, get back to your dorm and then, be ready for the 4 o'clock count. And I would always go back and lie down. It was too emotionally draining,
Yeah.
because you're saying goodbye and you're acting like it's all okay. I'll see you whenever I see you again. And you're
So
just
just putting that mask on
huge.
and putting it on and the effort that it takes to put it on and keep it
And keep it
on
on.
and keep it on and keep it on, and then you're just exhausted after that.
I, as
Yeah.
was my practice, and everyone knew, do not disturb Vicki, because I had to go down just to get myself back together again.
Hmm.
Right. And the beautiful part about it is that the women inside understand. Right. I did a lot for women inside. I think most of my friends who are on the outside now would tell you, that I did whatever I could to help. And that earned me the respect of many of them inside. So there was a lot of protection around me.
So what did you
there,
do when you said you did a lot?
so
What
I
did
would
you
do
do?
paper. So perfect example. There was a girl who was from my hometown in Fort Myers, and her husband had been in the system as well, but now he was home and doing really well and taking care of her kids. And somehow they weren't going to allow him visitation. And I said, we're going to appeal this, as is my practice. I'm like, okay, that doesn't sound like it's justice to me. So we did the paperwork. We sent it to the sort of, I guess, the regional office in Atlanta. I had people on the outside helping. See, this is what happens when you have a lot of resources available to you.
Right.
You can either be selfish or you can be super generous. And I said, my God, I don't know how anyone sees injustice and doesn't want to stand up and say, oh my God.
So you would help them navigate the system.
I would help them navigate the system. I would help them. Listen, when you have a lot of money at your disposal, people need things inside. There were some people, you have to buy everything. You have to buy your
Yeah.
laundry detergent. I would just be helpful. Like, what do you need?
Right.
I was known because I'm an accountant. I had an inventory of my commissary goods. I know it sounds crazy. The reason I had an inventory was because I said my locker is open to anyone. If you need something, feel free to take it, but you must mark it on the inventory sheet so when I go to commissary next week, I can replenish it for the rest of us.
Did they do that?
100%.
100%.
They were so blown away by my efficiency. I said, listen, if we're going to have enough for everybody, you can't take the last can of roast beef, right? Because then the next person that wants it won't have it because I won't have purchased it. So, it was small things like that I brought from the real world into this sub world, because it is a subculture. No one knows we're there 50 miles northwest of Orlando. We know we're there, but everyone else has forgotten us other than our families. And in many cases, families don't have the resources to come visit. So if you're, the federal system incarcerates people from Puerto Rico in the mainland. It costs about $800 to fly from Puerto Rico to Orlando. So it was not going to happen for many of these women, right? So, you kind of start to learn the stories of people. And towards the middle of my sentence, I told everybody, look, this is much like Catholic school. Everybody's wearing the same uniform. And you got to be happy here. You got to, like, I think the thing that was so disturbing was the mental illness that I witnessed firsthand, and how they put them on the 7 a.m. pill line and the 7 p.m. pill line. And, they announce pill line and the women walk like as if they're like little ants over to get their medicine. And I thought, this doesn't make any sense. These are not women. The system would certainly make you mentally ill, but if you had mental illness when you came in, the lack of real mental health services is what struck me most. That sort of
That's
zombie
still an
walking.
issue. I want to hear all about your experiences inside, but I also want to hear about what you
Yes.
have done outside, because
So
mental health services and education are still, like, we are way behind many other countries, and in the state too, in what we're providing.
well, and I will say this. So I had the
But I'm
good
not
fortune.
rushing you, so go
No,
ahead.
no, but I had the good fortune of being able to, and this is what I say. So I experienced every holiday inside, so I could remember what that would look like. There's reasons. God always has a plan, Dara, in my life. There are reasons why everything happened exactly how it happened. Because if I had not spent every holiday, I wouldn't be able to speak about the emotions tied to those holidays,
Yeah.
right? So I can remember having a Mother's Day party in my dorm and purchasing all these great things on the commissary. And for those of us as old as I am to remember the Let's Make a Deal show, I had all kinds of wonderful goodies that I bought on the commissary that nobody probably could afford at that time. And I placed all these really wonderful goodies behind door 1, 2, and 3, but they were like boxes. And we were able to play games. And because Mother's Day is a day of reckoning
Yeah.
inside.
Yeah.
You're either a mother, you have a mother, you know mothers. I mean, it's just one of the worst holidays because it
Very
brings home
heavy.
that you're not with your mother and your kids are not with you.
Yeah.
And so I had to turn that around. So I was always turning the narrative around for them. And then I became very involved in doing yoga and breath work. And by the time I left
Well,
prison,
you were an early ahead of your time back
way
then.
ahead, way ahead. Well, because it's hard to find a peaceful moment in a very small compound with 500 women. And so I began to meditate and also to do yoga and also to do a lot of breath work just to keep myself sane, right? And so then my group of friends started doing it. Before you knew it, we'd been given permission to go into the visitation room, which is rather large, and I had over 100 women breathing.
Wow.
Um, and just because I said to them, look, I know you need this medicine, but you also need to find yourself. You need to go inward. This is an opportunity. I called this a forced retreat,
A
but one
forced
that we should
retreat.
really take advantage of, because the noise on the outside is so fierce, and the world that you've come from is so chaotic, that here's an opportunity to settle in to yourself so that you can make changes, so when you return home, you're not the same person. I was convinced that if I could get them to start to do their work while they were there, they would go home differently, and their lives might be different, might be better. And that was what my prayer was the whole time I was there. How can I be helpful? And how can we all, me included, go out differently, right? Go out differently. So one fine day, as I told you, when I went to prison, uh, I did appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they chose not to take certiorari on my case, meaning that they did not hear my case. So my at that time, I thought that all my legal recourses were over, and I was just going to serve the rest of my time and be done with it. But God had a different plan. He, I had this wonderful friend, Congressman Peter Deutsch at the time, who was very friendly with President Clinton. Now, mind you, I'm a Republican, have been a lifelong Republican. And so, I didn't really have any what I'd call influence in the Clinton administration. But this is why it's so important to have bipartisan friendships. Um, we
Do they
really,
still exist? Well, we'll talk about that later.
yeah. So my husband was very friendly with Peter and went to bat for me with Peter and said, Peter, look, we're going to do a commutation application for Vicki, and anything you can do to put that in front of the president would be helpful. And right, and so in those early days in Washington, um, there was a lot politics was very different in 1990 to
Yes, it
1992
was.
when President Clinton was elected. And so a lot of people worked well together in Washington. And so it was not unusual that my husband, who was a Washington lobbyist, would have friends on both sides of the aisle. Not unusual at all in those days. So basically, we completed our commutation application, and Peter really, he knew I was innocent. This was striking for him as well. And so, wouldn't you know that our friend Peter Deutsch would have a good relationship with the president because of the Bosnia situation?
Oh.
Yes. And so, how many times did he have to travel on Air Force One with the president?
Oh.
And so, imagine how much access he had.
And so
And
he's whispering in his ear about
And let me tell you something,
Vicki.
Peter actually came to visit me in prison. And I remember because he was in Orlando with the president, and the president called him on the cell phone, which I thought was so crazy. And you just have to see the way God has worked in my life to know that how could that be, right? Like, how could it be that we would know the one congressman out of the 400 and some congressmen at that time that would have this relationship with the president when I needed that relationship most? And so, long story short, here came Thanksgiving of 2000. And on the compound, and I know if anyone who's been to federal prison is listening, they will understand what I'm going to say. And sense and feel anything that's out of place. By that I mean any movement, any conversations that you might see. And so that fateful day on November 21st, I remember coming to the lunch line, and the warden was there, which was not unusual. And there was other people from the administration, because often they would come to the camp, and that was when women could talk to people, higher ups, because remember, the camp is a satellite camp to what was at that time a men's medium and men's low security facility, right? So we were just kind of a satellite camp that provided satellite services to those facilities. Today, it is home to not only those in the camp, but to the two largest federal penitentiaries in Florida, male penitentiaries. So, but you just know something's not right. And I can't put my finger on it to this day, but there was a lot of us that were looking around saying, something's not quite right. Something's not right. And I will never be able to tell you what it was, if it was an energetic field that shifted. But I went back to work after lunch that day, and then I came home and as was my practice, right after the 4:00 count, I had two elderly women that were serving time there. And they were like my prison mothers. They ironed for me, they washed for me, they cooked for me, because they said, you take care of the rest of the girls, we'll take care of you. In many ways, there is this unspoken, I think, maternalistic society within a female prison, especially amongst women that are not violent, right? These are not violent women. These were women that were caught with drug charges that they didn't even, there was a grandmother there whose grandson was keeping his drugs in her freezer. When they raided, they took her in too. I mean, it was really kind of interesting to learn how the system has failed so many people because of the conspiracy charges, right? Not because of the possession charges. So anyway, I had my dinner, and then I went out to the track, which was my practice every single night. I would put on my headphones and I would walk a little bit just to be alone for a while. And I did not hear them calling my name down to the main office. First of all, the camp administrator leaves right after the 4:00 count. So there's really no one ever down there. So apparently they were calling me and calling me and calling me. And a inmate came to find me on the track, and she goes, "Oh, Vicki, I think you might be in trouble because they've been calling your name for the last 10 minutes. And I think it's Miss Cuffey, the administrator, who's calling you, and she's on the compound." This must have been about 6:30, maybe now. So I figured, oh my God, they're going to try. Who knows what's happening? I best prepare myself mentally for going to county jail, because they like to punish people. And that would be a real punishment, to send an inmate to county jail, because we don't have a what's called a special housing unit if you get into trouble. And I don't know what I might have done, maybe brought home socks to somebody who needed socks from the warehouse. Who knows? And so I prepared myself. I said, okay, no worries. And everybody was like, oh my God, oh my God. And I said, listen, no worries. We're good. Everybody, because you also have to keep the emotional level of the inmates down as well. Because remember, they come to love you, they come to respect you. They're going to be worried if you're in trouble.
Right.
So I tell everybody, don't worry.
They're going to bow up.
The big mistake I made that day, and I always say it, is I should have told them to empty my locker out of all that good stuff I had. Because had I known what was going to happen, I would have said to them immediately, send somebody up there and just put it all in a pillowcase and take it and distribute it as you will. Because what I did not know was that earlier that morning, why did things seem a little odd? Earlier that morning, they had received my commutation approval from the White House. And God knows what they were thinking, because I should have been taken out immediately, because it's an immediate order to release an inmate. And here I was counted on the 4 o'clock count, which would have been a habeas corpus situation for the prison.
Wow.
What were they waiting on? I don't know, a phone call from the president himself. But then they realized their error. And that is why they start to calm me down, because someone goes, oh my God, Vicki Lucas at the time is still on the compound.
Right.
And so there was this incredible rush. I remember calling my husband and saying, do you not see something? Do you not hear something different? Because remember, every call starts with, this is a call from a federal prison, but the call from her office, the administrator's office, was just a straight call.
Oh.
And it was very interesting, because my best friend was training the seeing eye dogs. And I saw when the van that was bringing those inmates back to the compound from the kennels was arriving, and I peeked through the window, and she saw me in the administrator's office. And she was like, oh, this must be terrible.
She's in trouble, right?
She's in trouble. And remember that every if you're smart, you have your husband or family member's telephone with somebody else's family member, so you can call them to let them know what's happening. Because if I were to be shipped out to county jail, my family would not know what had happened, right? Unless another inmate calls their husband or family member and says, call Vicki's husband and tell him what's happened. Right? It's a really wonderful system. So, she saw me, but I said, I'm okay. I think I'm okay. But, nobody knew anything. And so it's worthy of telling the story of how you can leave a prison so quickly. So
all your stuff you couldn't say.
So she brings, okay. So she says, you're going home. You've got to pack up. And I said, well, I've got things all over the compound, because I had books and recreation. I had books, and because I would get so many books, and you were only allowed to have so many books. And I said, that's ridiculous. See, because some of these rules make no sense. And I used to say to people, I serve a mighty God. And if somebody needs laundry detergent, I don't care what the punishment is, because my God will take care of me. He's asking me to take care of his people. So I just said, I'm going to have books everywhere. And I tell everyone where they were, check them out if you want, keep them in your room. I don't care, because there's just, when you have so much resources, you just want to give it away to people, because you hope that you will better their lives. Reading helps. So she brings all this junk in there. And I said, I can't go through it. And she goes, and you have 20 minutes to go through all this. I said, I don't have time to go through all of this. I mean, it's so many. I can't tell you how many of these laundry, what do you call them, baskets that roll, that they were bringing in. And you know what? I found out the next day when I got home, a inmate told me she threw it all away.
Oh wow! Rather than give it, just not just.
Because I said, listen, I don't care about any of this. Give it to the women on the compound. And she said no.
Wow.
So hundreds of dollars of things that women could have used found themselves in the dumpster.
Wow.
And I realized then, how terribly wrong it was. But listen, that was their way of, saying this is, you're not in charge, Vicki, we are.
We're going to do this. We're going to do this right now. We never do this. We only ever have one part pods. But Vicki's story is so compelling. We're going to take a short break, and we are going to come back for part 2.
A Deeper Dive with Dara is a podcast by City and State Florida, hosted by Dara Cam, produced by Ryan Daly, and music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs LLC and performed by Ryan Daly and Danny Reyes.